Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are standing in the Colosseum, surrounded by 50,000 screaming Romans, their voices crashing over you like ocean waves against stone cliffs. The sand beneath your feet is stained with blood that hasn't yet dried from the previous spectacle. Your hands grip a gladius, a Roman short sword that feels both impossibly heavy and desperately light. Across the arena, gates creak open, and your opponents emerge, men who want to kill you not because they hate you, but because their survival depends on your death. Now open your eyes and ask yourself, would you have the courage to face that moment? Would you fight with honor knowing you are already a dead man walking? This is the world that Ridley Scott brought to life in Gladiator. But the character who captured our imagination, Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix legions, never existed. Yet the truth behind the fiction is somehow more extraordinary, more brutal, and more human than anything Hollywood could invent. Before we journey into that truth, tell me, which country are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Early morning with coffee in hand, or late night when the world has gone quiet? Drop it in the comments because I want to know how far this story is reaching across the globe. The year is 180 AD, and the Roman Empire stands at a crossroads it doesn't yet recognize. For nearly 2 decades, Marcus Aurelius has ruled as emperor, a philosopher king who wrote meditations on virtue while his legions carved empires from the flesh of barbarian tribes. His reign has been marked by constant warfare along the northern frontiers, where Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, have pushed against Roman borders like wolves testing a fence for weakness. These are not the civilized enemies Rome once faced in Greece or Carthage. These are warriors who paint their faces with ash and blood, who worship gods of thunder and war, who see death in battle as the highest honor. Against them, Rome has sent its finest, disciplined legionaries who march in perfect formation, auxiliaries who know the local terrain, and commanders who understand that war is won not just with swords, but with strategy, logistics, and the will to endure when lesser men would break. But here is what Gladiator doesn't tell you. There was no single general named Maximus who commanded all the northern armies. Instead, there were dozens of commanders, each responsible for different sectors of a frontier that stretched from the Rhine to the Danube, a distance of over 1,500 kilometers. These men were not Hollywood heroes with perfect moral clarity. They were complex, often ruthless individuals who understood that maintaining the empire required acts of calculated brutality. They burned villages to deny supplies to enemy forces. They took hostages to ensure compliance from tribal leaders. They crucified deserters and rebels along roads as warnings. War in the 2nd century was not a gentleman's affair conducted according to noble rules. It was a grinding, desperate struggle for survival, where small mistakes could lead to entire legions being annihilated. Consider what it meant to be a Roman soldier on the Germanic frontier during this period. You were stationed in a fort made of timber and earth, surrounded by forests that seemed to stretch forever into darkness. Winter brought temperatures that froze wine in its amphora and turned your breath into clouds of ice. Your armor, designed for Mediterranean climates, became a cage of cold metal that sapped heat from your body. You ate grain porridge flavored with whatever local meat you could hunt or trade for: boar, deer, sometimes horse when supplies ran low. Your family, if you had one, was hundreds or thousands of miles in Italia or Hispania or Africa, and you would not see them for years, if ever. The soldiers around you became your brothers, the only family that mattered in this frozen corner of the world. And every day, you knew that beyond the tree line, warriors watched your fort with patient hatred. They studied your routines, counted your numbers, waited for the moment when your guard would drop. Attacks came without warning, a sentry found with his throat cut, a supply convoy ambushed and burned, a night raid that left dozens dead before dawn. This was not war as grand strategy. This was war as constant, grinding terror that wore down even the bravest men until they jumped at shadows and slept with weapons in their hands. The real commanders who led these soldiers were men like Marcus Valerius Maximinus, who served under Marcus Aurelius and whose name bears striking similarity to the fictional Maximus. We know frustratingly little about Maximinus compared to emperors and senators, because Roman historians cared more about politics in Rome than about the men who died keeping the frontier secure. What we do know comes from military records, inscriptions on monuments, and occasional mentions in letters. Maximinus rose through the ranks during the Marcomannic Wars, a series of conflicts that began in 166 AD when Germanic tribes crossed the Danube in unprecedented numbers. These were not mere raids. This was a migration of peoples, entire tribes seeking new lands because climate change and pressure from tribes further east had made their traditional territories uninhabitable. Imagine being the general receiving reports that 50,000 Germanic warriors and their families, women, children, elderly, are moving toward your section of the frontier. You have perhaps 20,000 legionaries and auxiliaries under your command, spread across multiple forts. Your supply lines stretch back hundreds of miles through territories that are only nominally pacified. Winter is approaching, which means rivers will freeze, creating natural bridges that nullify your defensive advantages. You must decide, do you meet them in the field and risk a pitched battle where superior numbers could overwhelm your discipline? Or do you let them cross and fight a defensive war that could last years? Every choice carries the weight of thousands of lives and the possibility of catastrophic failure that could echo through history. This is the reality that Hollywood simplified into good versus evil, hero versus villain. Real warfare was far more morally ambiguous. When Marcus Aurelius ordered the enslavement of captured Germanic tribes, he did so not from cruelty, but from pragmatic calculation. Slaves were needed to work Roman mines and farms, replacing labor lost to plague and war. When Roman commanders executed tribal leaders who had sued for peace, they did so because previous peace agreements had been broken repeatedly, and trust was a luxury the empire could no longer afford. War hardens men into instruments of policy, and the longer it continues, the more difficult it becomes to remember why civilization matters. Let me pause here for just a moment to ask you this. If you're finding this journey into the real history behind Gladiator compelling, hit that like button. It tells me you want more truth behind the legends, more stories that peel back Hollywood's beautiful lies to reveal the complex, messy, magnificent reality underneath. The gladiatorial games that form the centerpiece of Ridley Scott's film were indeed a real and significant part of Roman culture, but not quite in the way the movie portrays. By 80 AD, the games had evolved from simple funeral rites into elaborate state-sponsored spectacles designed to reinforce social hierarchies and provide violent entertainment to a population that had been raised on conquest and martial glory. The Colosseum, properly called the Flavian Amphitheater, could hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators depending on how tightly they packed in. Beneath its sand-covered floor lay a complex network of tunnels, cages, and mechanical lifts that could raise animals, scenery, and fighters into the arena with theatrical timing. But here's what most people don't understand about gladiators. The majority were not slaves fighting to the death in every match. They were trained professionals, expensive investments that their owners wanted to preserve. A well-trained gladiator represented years of instruction, specialized diet, and medical care. Killing them indiscriminately would be like burning money. Most gladiatorial combats ended with first blood or submission, not death. The crowd's famous thumbs up or thumbs down was actually a later myth. We're not entirely certain what gesture Romans used to signal mercy or execution, and it likely varied by region and period. What we do know is that gladiators developed loyal followings, that women wrote graffiti professing their love for famous fighters, that successful gladiators could earn enough to buy their freedom and retire as wealthy men. However, there were special occasions when the games became genuinely lethal spectacles. During imperial triumphs, after major military victories, the emperor would sometimes stage mass executions disguised as combat. Condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and those deemed enemies of the state would be forced into the arena against professional gladiators or wild animals with no real chance of survival. These weren't fights. They were public murders designed to demonstrate Roman power and the consequences of opposing it. If a general or nobleman fell from imperial favor and was condemned to the arena, as happens to the fictional Maximus, he would face opponents specifically instructed to make his death both painful and entertaining. This brings us to Commodus, the emperor portrayed so memorably by Joaquin Phoenix as a scheming patricidal maniac. The real Commodus was indeed a troubled and increasingly unstable ruler, but the historical record is far more complex than the film suggests. Marcus Aurelius did name his biological son as his successor, which was actually unusual. Previous emperors had adopted capable adults as heirs rather than passing power to their own children. This had created a period called the Five Good Emperors, where merit rather than bloodline determined succession. Marcus Aurelius's decision to elevate Commodus broke that pattern and arguably set Rome on a path toward decline. But Commodus didn't murder his father. Marcus Aurelius died of illness in 180 AD, possibly plague, possibly simply the accumulation of years spent campaigning in harsh conditions. Commodus was with him when he died, and there's no credible historical evidence of foul play. What is true is that Commodus was utterly unsuited for the responsibilities of empire. He had been raised in luxury, given everything he wanted, told from birth that he was destined for greatness. He had never commanded troops in genuine combat, never made life or death decisions that would affect millions, never learned the discipline and self-sacrifice that characterized his father's reign. When Commodus became emperor at age 18, he immediately sought peace with the Germanic tribes his father had spent years fighting. This wasn't entirely unreasonable. The wars had drained the treasury and exhausted the legions, but Commodus negotiated from a position of impatience rather than strength, granting concessions that more experienced diplomats considered excessive. He then returned to Rome and devoted himself to the pleasures of power, lavish games, sexual indulgences, and an increasingly bizarre obsession with personally participating in gladiatorial combat. Yes, Commodus really did fight in the arena, but not as the film depicts. He didn't face equals in honest combat. Instead, he arranged carefully choreographed matches where his opponents were instructed to lose, where he fought against wounded or drugged animals, where every spear throw and sword stroke was guaranteed success. He genuinely believed these staged victories proved his martial prowess. The Roman Senate and aristocracy watched these spectacles with a mixture of horror and contempt, but they dared not object openly. Commodus had begun executing anyone he perceived as a threat, and paranoia gripped the imperial court. The conspiracy to assassinate Commodus did happen, though not as portrayed in Gladiator. On the last day of 192 AD, after a 12-year reign of increasing madness, Commodus's inner circle decided he had to die. His concubine, Marcia, attempted to poison him, but Commodus vomited up the poison. Realizing the plot had been discovered and their lives were forfeit, the conspirators sent Narcissus, a wrestler who sometimes trained with the emperor, to strangle him in his bath. This inglorious end, murdered by a wrestler while defenseless, was particularly humiliating for an emperor who had styled himself as a great warrior. There was no dramatic duel in the Colosseum, no final moment of redemption or revenge, just a desperate act by terrified conspirators who saw no other way to save themselves and, perhaps, Rome. If you've made it this far into this story, I want you to do something for me. Share this video with someone who loves history, someone who watched Gladiator and wondered what was real. Let's spread the truth behind the myth together. Now, let's talk about what might have inspired the character of Maximus beyond mere fiction. In the chaotic period following Commodus's death, Rome entered a phase called the Year of the Five Emperors, when multiple claimants fought for power. One of these was Septimius Severus, a general commanding legions on the Danube frontier, who marched on Rome and seized the throne. Severus was not born into the highest aristocracy. His family came from North Africa, from what is now Libya. He rose through military merit, earning the loyalty of his soldiers through shared hardship and competent leadership. He understood what motivated men to fight and die, and he used that understanding to build an army personally loyal to him, rather than to abstract concepts of Rome or Senate. Severus's rise demonstrates a crucial truth about the Roman military system. Loyalty flowed upward to commanders who earned it through competence, fair treatment, and shared sacrifice. Soldiers didn't fight for eagles and standards because they were pretty. They fought for them because those symbols represented their unit, their brothers, their collective honor. When a general like Severus or the fictional Maximus commanded absolute loyalty from his troops, it was because he had proven himself worthy of it, sleeping in the same mud, eating the same rations, standing in the same danger. Roman military discipline was harsh by modern standards, with severe punishments for cowardice or insubordination, but it was applied equally. A general who demanded sacrifice from his men while living in comfort would quickly lose his respect, and eventually, his command.
This is what makes the opening battle scene in Gladiator so powerful, even if it's not historically accurate in its details. We see Maximus walking among his soldiers before the fight, speaking to them individually, making himself present as a human rather than a distant commander. Real Roman generals did this. They understood that courage is a fragile thing that must be constantly reinforced through ritual, speech, and personal example. Before a major battle, commanders would address their troops, reminding them of previous victories, invoking the gods, promising rewards, and making the stakes clear. These speeches weren't just propaganda, they were psychological preparation for the traumatic experience of combat. Think about what it means to stand in a formation, shoulder to shoulder with other men, waiting for the order to advance into a storm of arrows, spears, and swords. Your rational mind is screaming at you to run, to preserve your life at any cost. Your body is flooding with adrenaline that makes your hands shake and your vision narrow. You've soiled yourself, as have the men around you, because fear does this to human bodies regardless of courage or training. The only thing keeping you in formation is trust. Trust in the men beside you, trust in your training, trust in your commander's competence, and trust that if you hold, if you endure, victory is possible. Roman tactical doctrine emphasized maintaining formation above individual heroics. A legion functioned as a single organism, each soldier a cell that contributed to the whole. The front ranks fought with shields locked, stabbing with short swords at any enemy who came within reach. When those men tired, they would rotate backward and fresh soldiers would take their place, a complex maneuver that required extensive training to execute under combat stress. This rotation system meant that Roman soldiers could fight for hours without exhausting themselves, while their opponents, fighting as individuals or in loose formations, would gradually wear down. It wasn't dramatic or heroic in the Hollywood sense. It was methodical, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. The Germanic tribes the Romans fought employed very different tactics. They relied on the ferocity of initial charges, on overwhelming numbers crashing into enemy lines like an avalanche. Their warriors were individually skilled, often larger and stronger than Roman soldiers due to diet and genetics. They fought with long spears, battle axes, and massive shields. But they lacked the organizational infrastructure that made Roman arms effective. When a Germanic charge was stopped and the warriors found themselves in grinding, sustained combat, their lack of formal rotation systems meant that fatigue would set in. Once fatigue broke their cohesion, Roman discipline would methodically dismantle them. This is why generals were so critical. The side that maintained cohesion longest, that adapted to changing battlefield conditions, that exploited enemy mistakes, that side usually won. A commander needed to read the flow of battle, to know when to commit reserves, when to refuse one flank and strengthen another, when to order a controlled retreat rather than let withdrawal become a rout. These decisions had to be made with incomplete information, in the chaos and confusion of thousands of men trying to kill each other, with the knowledge that a mistake could lead to disaster.
And here's something Gladiator captures perfectly, even if unintentionally. the aftermath of victory is not glorious. The camera pans across the battlefield after the opening fight, showing bodies of both Romans and Germans scattered in the mud and snow. In reality, the aftermath of an ancient battle was a scene of almost incomprehensible horror. The wounded lay among the dead, crying out for water, for their mothers, for someone to end their suffering. Medical treatment was primitive. Wounds became infected, broken bones healed crooked if they healed at all, and men who survived combat often died of their injuries in the days that followed. The stench of open bowels, blood, and death would hang over the battlefield for weeks. Local scavengers, both human and animal, would pick through the corpses, taking anything of value. The victorious soldiers, even as they celebrated, knew that they had survived by luck as much as skill. That arrow that missed your head by inches could have killed you. That spearman you killed had been trying to kill you, and if he had been slightly faster, or you slightly slower, you would be the corpse in the mud. This awareness created a complex psychological burden. Ancient soldiers suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though they had no name for it. They dealt with nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, and emotional numbness through whatever means available: alcohol, religion, the camaraderie of other soldiers who understood what they had experienced. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really consider this. Knowing what you now know about ancient warfare, about the fear and blood and mud and horror, would you have the courage to stand in formation when the order came to advance? Would you trust in your training and your brothers enough to walk towards certain danger? Think about that, and then think about the men who did this not once, but dozens of times over careers that spanned decades. Whatever else we might say about Roman soldiers, they were not cowards. The film's portrayal of Maximus's fall from grace and enslavement, while fictional, touches on a real phenomenon in Roman society. Political fortunes could reverse with stunning speed. A general celebrating a triumph one day could find himself executed as a traitor the next, depending on imperial whim or senatorial conspiracy. The Romans had a concept called dignitas, which encompassed honor, reputation, and social standing. For a nobleman to lose his dignitas was to lose everything that made life worth living. This is why exile was sometimes considered a fate worse than death. It meant permanent separation from your status, your family, your identity as a Roman citizen. Slavery in Rome was a complex institution that modern people often misunderstand. It wasn't based primarily on race or ethnicity as slavery in the Americas would be. Anyone could become a slave through conquest, piracy, debt, or being born to slave parents. Slaves worked in every occupation, from mines to households to administrative positions. Some slaves lived in brutal conditions and died young from overwork and abuse. Others, particularly Greek slaves or those with specialized skills, lived relatively comfortable lives and could eventually earn or buy their freedom. A freedman, a former slave who had been manumitted, could rise to positions of significant wealth and influence, though social prejudice against their origins never entirely disappeared. For someone like the fictional Maximus, a nobleman and general reduced to slavery, the psychological trauma would have been immense. Everything that defined his identity, his rank, his authority, his freedom to make choices would have been stripped away. He would have been property, subject to the whims of whoever owned him. If he was sold to a gladiatorial trainer, as happens in the film, he would have entered a strange subculture where slaves trained as professional fighters, where success in the arena could bring a kind of fame, even if it couldn't restore freedom or status. The gladiatorial schools, called ludi, were businesses operated by managers called lanistae. These were not places of torture and cruelty, they were training facilities designed to produce skilled fighters. Gladiators received better food than ordinary slaves, access to medical care from specialized doctors, and were housed in conditions that, while certainly not luxurious, were better than what many free poor Romans experienced. The lanista had a financial incentive to keep his gladiators healthy and combat-ready. A dead or crippled gladiator represented lost investment and lost future earnings. Training focused on specific fighting styles. The Murmillo fought with a gladius and large rectangular shield, relying on defense and short, powerful attacks. The retiarius used a net and trident, emphasizing speed and distance. The thrax carried a curved sword and small shield, requiring agility and precision. Each style had strengths and weaknesses, and part of the entertainment value for audiences came from watching different styles clash. A skilled gladiator could read his opponent's style, adapt his tactics mid-fight, and exploit weaknesses. This required intelligence and training, not just brute strength. But beneath the professionalism and training, the fundamental reality remained. Gladiators existed to provide violent entertainment to a society that had grown accustomed to spectacle. The games served multiple purposes. They were a release valve for social tensions, giving the urban poor free entertainment that kept them pacified. They were demonstrations of imperial power and generosity, as emperors sponsored increasingly elaborate games to win popular support. They were reinforcement of social hierarchies, with seating in the amphitheater strictly divided by class and status. And they were reminders of Rome's military prowess, as condemned enemies of the state died for the entertainment of the citizens they had opposed. The psychology of watching other humans fight and sometimes die is something we might find disturbing, but it's worth remembering that societies throughout history have found different forms of violence acceptable or even entertaining. Medieval Europeans watched public executions. Modern audiences pay to watch boxing, mixed martial arts, and violent films. We've channeled the impulse differently, made it less immediately lethal, but the fascination with controlled violence persists. The Romans simply expressed it more directly. When I think about what Gladiator gets right, despite its historical inaccuracies, it's the emotional core, the idea that a man can lose everything and still choose to fight with honor, that courage means continuing to struggle even when hope seems lost, that our actions echo beyond our lifetimes. These themes resonate because they're fundamentally human, not because they're historically accurate. The real generals and soldiers who fought on Rome's frontiers left behind fewer monuments than emperors and senators, but their sacrifices maintained an empire that would shape Western civilization for millennia. When the legions finally failed, when Rome fell to waves of migration and internal collapse in the 5th century, it marked the end of an era. The roads they built still carry traffic. The cities they founded still exist. The language they spoke evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, and Portuguese. The legal concepts they developed formed the basis of modern law in much of the world. All of this was made possible by men whose names we've forgotten, who stood in formation on cold mornings in hostile lands and chose duty over desertion. This is the truth Hollywood didn't want you to know, not because it's scandalous, but because it's complex. It doesn't fit neatly into 2 hours of runtime. It requires nuance and ambiguity. It asks us to sympathize with people who did terrible things in service of a system we would find morally questionable. But history isn't a simple story of good versus evil. It's thousands of individual humans making choices based on incomplete information and competing loyalties, trying to survive and occasionally trying to do something that will outlast them. Maximus Decimus Meridius never existed, but the world that created the need for his story certainly did. Men really did command legions on hostile frontiers. They really did balance military necessity against personal honor. They really did wonder if their sacrifices meant anything, if history would remember them, if they were building something lasting or just postponing inevitable collapse. These questions don't have easy answers, which is precisely why they matter. So let me leave you with this. Knowing now the reality behind the fiction, understanding that war was not noble duels but mud and blood and bureaucracy and logistics, that heroes were complicated humans who made difficult choices with imperfect information, that empires were built not by titans but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Does that make the story more meaningful or less? Does stripping away the Hollywood polish diminish the tale, or does it reveal something more profound about courage and sacrifice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey through history behind Hollywood has been worth your time, consider subscribing because there are so many more legends we can examine, so many more truths we can uncover together. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is not what happened in some distant past, it's the foundation we're still building on today.